Hi Algebra 2, this is Mrs. Langford. Get to your 3.1 notes packet and this spot. This is where we were on Friday, and this is just a short video to just go over what we covered on Friday, because at least in third hour we kind of finished it up quickly, and I want you to be sure you know how to factor a trinomial, so a quadratic like this one here, that has an A value of 1. And so the method that we talked about was guess and check, and you can also think of it as level 1 quadratic factoring, and that's because the A value equals 1. So with this type of factoring, what we're doing is we're trying to solve this quadratic. So we want to break it apart into its factors, the things that you can multiply together that will give you that quadratic equation. And so you can think of it as you're going to undo what you would do to multiply to get there, or undo the FOIL, the multiplication method. So we talked about how when you actually multiply to get a quadratic, the first thing that you can do is multiply your first terms together, and that will give you this first term in your expression. Then you can multiply the outside terms together and the inside terms together. And when you combine those, add or subtract them, you get the middle term. And then finally, when you multiply those last terms together, you get the last term in the quadratic. So what we're looking for is two numbers that multiply together to give you the C value. You can think of it as A times C, since A is just 1. But multiply to give you the C value, and combine to give you, make that a little more clear, combine to give you the B value. So those are the two questions that we ask ourselves. What two numbers can I multiply that'll give me C, or A times C, and combine to give me the B value? And when I say combine, I mean add or subtract. So I know that in both classes we did this first example together, and I'm going to go ahead and go over the next two. So this one and this one. We're going to save number 3 for later. I know we started it in 4th hour. We'll come back to it tomorrow. Okay, so when it says factor and solve, that means you're trying to break it apart to the two expressions that will multiply to give you that quadratic. So the first thing is to look at the A value. If it's 1, you're dealing with just a level 1 quadratic. So you can simply ask yourself, what two numbers can I multiply that will give me, and just pick out A, B, and C. That will give me C, or A times C, because A is 1, and combine to give me B. Notice that the sign goes with the number. And then think of factor pairs of 45. So we've got 1 and 45, 3 and 15, I'm working my way up, 5 and 9. Okay, and then I realize that 5 and 9, if I combine them in some way, I can get a -4. So what I do is I just place my numbers, and then I figure out which one I want to be negative. Well, I'm going to make my 9 negative, because when I add 5 and -9, I will get -4. And so those are my two numbers that will go in my binomial expressions. And then the last step is we want to go ahead and solve. So there's a property in math that's called the zero product property rule. It says if two things, so here's thing number 1, here's thing number 2, it's a logical thought. If two things multiply together and equal 0, that means one or both of them have to be 0. So we're going to use the thought with, well, let's just see if both of them equal 0, then what we get. And when we do that, then we end up with our solutions. So where the quadratic crosses the x-axis, where y is 0. So these are our solutions. So after factoring, you just take one step further. You set each of those factors. So here's factor number 1, here's factor number 2. You set them equal to 0 and solve. So number 2, we're asked to factor and solve. So we notice that this is a level 1. We make note of our A, B, and C values. And this is just a little organizer for me where I can write my numbers. So I'm looking for 2 numbers to multiply that'll give me positive 35. That's my C, or my A times C value. And will combine to give me my B value, 12. So I think of factors of 35, 1 and 35, 5 and 7. There they are. And that means that it will factor as A plus 5 times A plus 7. And now I go ahead and solve. So I just use that logical thought from the zero product property rule that one or both of them have to equal 0. So I'm just going to see what I get if both of them equal 0. So I get these 2 solutions. That this quadratic is crossing the x-axis at -5 and -7. Now on number 3, if we put this in standard form, so we're just going to move the 2 over, right away notice that our A value is not 1. This is level 2. So tomorrow I'm going to show you level 2 factoring. It's very similar to level 1, but we have to take into consideration that extra value for A. And it changes our factoring just a little bit. So now I'm going to do some extra problems that are not in your notes packet. So you might want to pause and get to a sheet of paper so that you can work through some of these with me. Sorry, it's my dog. The first one is x squared plus 8x plus 16. Now I did not write the directions, but let's say factor and solve. And I should say factor if possible, because sometimes you will get a quadratic that will not be factorable, and that means we'll have to use another method to solve. So factor if possible, and then if we can factor it, then we're going to solve. So I notice that this one is a level 1. I notice my A, B, and C values. I want 2 numbers that will multiply to give me C, or A times C, and combine to give me my B value. So I think of factors of 16. 1 and 16, 2 and 8, 4 and 4. Now when you have factors that are exactly the same, you don't need to solve both of them because you're going to get the same answer, 1. So this means the vertex is our solution, and this is going to just touch down on the x-axis where x is -4. Now look at the next problem. So factoring is a process, and the first thing you want to look in this process is, do I have a common greatest common factor? And in this case we do. 2 will divide into each of these. So we're going to divide out a 2 before we start. That's just part of the factoring process. Now we'll look at this trinomial that we're left with, and we'll just ask ourselves the question, what 2 numbers can I multiply to give me C, or A times C, and combine to give me B? So I think of factors of 8, 1 and 8, 2 and 4. Now I keep the 2 out front because that is part of my factor. You can think of it as your factor tree, how we've talked about it. Because it takes all of these things together, these 3 things together, multiplied to give you what you started with. Now when we go to solve, the first thing that we want to do though is, well, we can just divide this 2 away. So it's not going to affect our solutions, but we do want to have it in our factor step. Then we'll set each of these equal to 0. We'll subtract the 2 over. So there's our first solution, and here's our second. Now x squared plus 7x plus 6, and make sure, I'm sure you are, but when you need to, pause the video, write down a problem, and then start it back up again. So it's a level 1 factoring. Notice your A, B, and C. So look for 2 numbers that multiply to give you C, or A times C, and combine to give you B. So we've got 1 and 6, there we go. So this will factor as x plus 1 times x plus 6. So again, we'll just think of it, that's like our factor tree. If we multiplied those back, we would get the quadratic that we started with. We set them each equal to 0 and solve. I'm sure you're starting to see the pattern. The solutions are the opposite signs of the factors. If it's just a simple x expression like these are, x plus 1, x plus 6. Now look at the next one. Definitely write this one down. X squared minus 3x minus 46. Notice it's level 1 factoring. We've got a, b, and c. Two numbers that will multiply to give you negative 46 and combine to give you negative 3. So you think about the factors, 1 and 46, 2 and 23, and that's about it. When you combine 2 and 23, you get 21 if you subtract them, 25 if you add them. So that's not going to give you 3. So in this case, you try all the factor pairs that you can, and then you just realize, you know what, this is not factorable. All right, next one. This is a problem that I'm going to come back to after I give you a few more notes. So first of all, let's just start it. So write this one down, 2x squared minus 18 equals 0. Notice we have a greatest common factor, so let's factor the 2 out of there. And then, well, we'll go ahead with the level 1 factoring. We want two numbers, so in this case we only have an a and a c value. Well, b value is 0. We have it, it's just 0. So two numbers that'll multiply to give you negative 9 and combine to give you 0. So you think of factors of 9, well, 3 and 3, if we make one of them negative, that'll work for us. So it will factor as x plus 3 times x minus 3. And then we can divide our 2, set these both equal to 0. So x will equal negative 3, and x will equal 3. Now this is a good time to add these. This is also something that you won't find in your notes packet. So continue on that piece of paper. What we just solved is a difference of squares. And so in math we always look to see if we can identify patterns. Problems that solve in the same way every time. And if they do, and we can see that pattern, then we can just use the pattern to make our solving quicker. So the problem that we just worked was 2x squared minus 18 equals 0. We factored out a 2 and then had x squared minus 9 to work with. So when you have a difference, meaning it's a subtraction problem, of two things that are being squared, so that's what it means by a difference of two squares, then there's a pattern that you can always follow. It will always factor as a squared, well, sorry, when you notice that you have a difference of two squares, a squared minus b squared, it will always factor as a plus b times a minus b. Or, remember in the one that we just worked, it factored as x plus 3 times x minus 3. So here's how it works. In the x squared minus 100, we look and right away you've got two terms. So you think, I'm going to see if this is a difference of squares. So you just ask yourself, what can I square to get x squared? Well, obviously we can square x. So what I'm putting in the parentheses is the thing that's being squared. We'll call it our a term. Now, we think this is our difference, and then we just think of 100 separate from the negative sign. So we know that 100 is 10 squared. So the reason why I have that in the parentheses is because that is the number that's being squared to give us 100. That is our b value. So following the pattern, this is going to factor as our a, or x, plus our b, or 10, and then x minus 10. So all you have to do is figure out if you have a difference of squares, pattern, and then what's being squared. So, and let's go ahead and add our 0. So in this, x squared minus 121, you can notice that you've got x that's being squared and 11. And if you're unsure of that, just put it on your calculator. Put 121 on your calculator. So this will factor as, and take the square root of it, I should say, x plus 11 times x minus 11. It's just a shortcut. So if we set them both equal to 0, we'll get x equals 11 and x equals negative 11, x equals positive 11. Now on this one, notice we have a greatest common factor. So the first thing we need to do is factor out a 3. And then look, you've got a difference of squares. So we know that it's x that's being squared and 3. So it will factor as x plus 3 times x minus 3. And if we solve that, then x will equal negative 3 and x will equal positive 3. Here's one more, okay? So again, just be on the lookout for a greatest common factor. If you have a negative in the front, go ahead and factor out that negative. Then you're left with two terms. They're being subtracted. So just see if they're the difference of squares. Well, they are, because it's x that's being squared and 5 that's being squared to give you 25. So then to solve it, we'll just divide our negative 2 away, set these both equal to 0, and solve. All right. So your assignment tonight is to take a few in the book to factor and go ahead and solve them. So if they aren't, set them equal to 0 and take them all the way down to the solving step. And then there's a worksheet that is on our website. It's the Factor and Solve worksheet. Just pull that up and work numbers 1 through 8, factoring and taking them all the way down to solving them. And you're going to do the side that has the x variables only. All right, and we'll see you tomorrow.